channel. It is almost the end of 2024 and the start of 2025, which means it's that time of year where everyone's starting to think about New Year's resolutions, and I know some of you guys have disc golf related New Year's resolutions. So in this video, I'm going to be giving you guys some ideas on how to absolutely crush your 2025 disc golf New Year's resolutions. We're going to talk about a few different topics here, starting with, how do we get inspired to set our New Year's resolutions, create a plan, how do we get the most out of our motivation, out of discipline, etc., and eventually how do we form habits, how do we create goals and use them in the appropriate way, all of these things to kind of get us directionally toward our goals. First thing we're going to talk about is inspiration. So if you're watching this video, you've probably already been inspired in some way to improve some element of your disc golf game. Otherwise, why would you be making a New Year's resolution? But inspiration can come from a variety of things, perhaps maybe watching the Disc Golf Network and seeing professionals play, or watching a professional player's Instagram and seeing them rip really big drives, or perhaps you're tired of getting your butt kicked by that one person in your local disc golf league. Inspiration is a very powerful thing. It can be kind of the spark, the impetus for change, but you need to understand that it is very, very temporary. Inspiration is not going to carry you through an entire year of consistent practice. So we need to take this powerful impetus to get started and leverage that into a plan. When we're wanting to create a plan to get better at disc golf, the number one thing we want to start with is something that we can adhere to. Okay, so consistency over time is key. It's better to do a small number of sessions per week and be very consistent with it and build off of that, rather than to say you're going to do 4 days a week and frequently fail to meet that, or occasionally here and there actually put in a longer practice session. You need to actually schedule into your weekly plan something that you can stick to. Next, I would say you want to save a little bit of room for experimentation, because ultimately how you get better is going to vary a little bit from person to person. There are general things that you want to do technique-wise, shots-wise, that are going to be pretty universal, but there's also a lot of room for individualization when it comes to form. There's a lot of techniques that might work for one person that just don't work for another person. So when you're coming up with a plan, leave a little bit of room for that experimentation so that you can dial in what works for you. Practicing is actually a skill in and of itself, and something that you're going to improve at as you go along this journey to get better at disc golf. Another thing you want to make sure you do is leave room for flexibility, because life happens, and if you're going to stick to this practice plan over the course of a year, you're not going to have identical week to week to week to week. You're going to have things come up. You're going to have life events that get in the way of your practice. So, if you're normally practicing maybe Monday and Thursday, leave a little bit of flexibility there. So like if something comes up Monday, you can push it to Tuesday, you can push it to Wednesday. Don't expect yourself to be able to stick to something that's very, very rigid. It's just not practical for almost everybody. And then understand that over time, as you're executing this plan, like we said, practice is a skill in and of itself. It's something that you're going to get better at over time. And eventually you're going to start to form habits, and this whole process will get easier provided you stick to it consistently. Another thing we want to maybe avoid is not getting started until we have the perfect plan. The perfect plan is completely useless, again, if you can't stick to it. We want the perfect plan for you, or just rather a good plan that we can improve over time. And one more thing we want to avoid is getting into this loop of constantly watching a ton of instructional content, but never actually implementing it. So when you're looking for sources on, what drills should I do to improve whatever skill, there's so many good ones. I think it's best to pick a small number of them and really stick to what they're saying, whether that's the free content you can find on YouTube. There's plenty of really great channels, or if you actually want to go to like the Power Disc Golf Academy, shameless plug, and follow their plan, I would recommend just kind of one or two really, really good sources and stick to those for a while and see what you can get to work for you. And if you've stuck with it for a while and you're doing these drills and they're not quite working, then maybe consider switching sources. But it's kind of like if you were training in any other sport, like maybe you were trying to get good at tennis and you just constantly hop from coach to coach to coach, it would be really hard to actually implement any of these changes, because you're constantly a similar note, it's best to really focus on one thing per skill that you're working on. And what do I mean per skill? Per skill category, if you will. So backhand's a skill. That's very different from forehand. That's very different from putting. Those are kind of your three main ones. Perhaps you can throw in like an overhand kind of throw in there as well, but those are kind of the three that most people work at. I highly, highly, highly recommend you pick one thing to work on for your forehand and one thing to work on for your backhand, one thing to work on with putting. Not more than that, because it's just hard for your brain to really do two big changes at once. Better to do one change and then come to the next change and then go to the next change. So we've set our plan in motion. Now we're going to talk about the next kind of force that's going to push us towards our goals, and that's motivation. Motivation is another really powerful tool, a little bit stronger than inspiration because now we actually have a plan. Motivation is kind of your desire to do the plan. So ideally, we would have high motivation as often as possible, because that means we're going to go do our practice strictly because we want to. We're not having to make ourselves do it. But in reality, it is something that is not constant. It will come and go. You'll have weeks where you're highly motivated. You'll have weeks where you're not highly motivated. But we can kind of stack the odds in our favor by boosting our motivation. And so here's some ideas on how to do that. A common question I see on forums, whether it's Facebook, Reddit, and I've gotten asked in person, is where do you start? What skills should you learn first? What types of discs should I be throwing first? And what's funny is I'll see people write entire theses, it seems, on what they think beginners should start with. My take on this is it ultimately does not matter where you start. I think for new players or players who are deciding to take that next step and get good at disc golf, the important thing is to work on something that you're really excited about. And the reason is motivation, right? Let's say we've got a young guy who he got inspired by watching Anthony Barela throw crazy distance, and he wants to get out there and get to where he's throwing 500, 600, 700 feet, whatever. And then he goes on Reddit and some guy says, no, you need to only throw putters until you can throw at least this far, and then you can start throwing mid-ranges, and then you can start throwing fairway drivers. Well, okay, that kid was so excited to throw long distance drives, and now if he goes to practice, he thinks he can't go and try to throw long distance drives. He has to do it this other way, and he's just not excited to go practice. He's going to quit after a couple of weeks because it's just not very fun. Whereas if he went with what his initial excitement was, which was to throw really far, and he starts going down that rabbit hole, he's more likely to actually stick to his practice plan, which, as we said previously, is the number one most important thing, especially when you're first starting out. Another reason it doesn't ultimately matter where you start is if you stick with this practice plan with pursuing improvement in disc golf long enough, you're going to get good at the other skills that you didn't start with. What will happen is this kid, our kid who wants to throw far, goes down the rabbit hole of how do you throw far. He's going to have to learn a good grip, good footwork, how to do a proper pull through and brace. He's going to have to learn all of the facets of good backhand technique. All of that's going to transfer to how to throw putters and mid-ranges and any other kind of backhand shot. And eventually what will happen is he will get to a point where he's throwing 500 plus feet, and he's going to league, and he's getting his butt kicked by the old guy who can't throw further than 300 but gets up and down from anywhere inside of 300 and makes all of his putts. And then that kid's going to get competitive, and he's going to think, okay, well, I'm tired of losing to this guy, so what do I got to do? I got to start making my putts. And so he's already got this great foundation of really, really good practice that he's developed by pursuing distance, that, you know, he can go from, okay, 3 days a week I'm practicing for distance. Well, now I'll keep one of those days continuing to work on backhand, but I'll make those other 2 days be putting and approach days. So a little tweak to his already really good practice plan. He's now found inspiration and motivation to work on the short game stuff. He's actually going to stick to it now, and he's eventually going to become a more well-rounded player. Ultimately, just does not matter where you start. Start with the thing that makes you really excited, and that's going to help you stay motivated to stick to your plan. Next thing to help boost your motivation is you need to pick a number of days and a duration of your practice sessions that you can very, very easily stick to. This goes for consistency like we talked about earlier with the plan, but there's also kind of a psychological benefit to consistently smashing little goals. All right, so we'll take this another example. Let's say that your goal was to practice 2 times a week for 1 hour each time, so 2 hours per week. And if you can fit it in, get a third day. Maybe you're not as busy that week, so you're able to spend a third day in the field. Awesome, bonus day. And you're able to stick to that consistently. Every single week that you do that, you're getting a small little win in your head, and that's going to help build motivation. Now let's take an alternative goal, perhaps, was to do 4 times per week. But frequently you don't quite hit 4 times, you're hitting 3. Some weeks you're really busy and you're just barely getting in there for 2 times a week. In both of these scenarios, you're practicing the same amount of time per week, but one feels like a win every week and the other one feels like a failure. The more wins you stack up, the more little wins you stack up, the more motivating it is. The more failures you stack up, the more demotivating it is, even though in both of these scenarios you're practicing the same amount of time. My last tip for boosting motivation is to just take notice of the little things that tend to be motivating for you. As like we said with our last example of, working 2 times a week and smashing that versus making it a goal to be 4 times a week and frequently missing it, what other things feel like little wins or feel like little losses? And how can you lean into those and leverage those to try to keep your motivation up as much as possible? I said motivation has some ebbs and flows. It's not going to be consistently high no matter how much we boost it, even with all of these little tips and tricks. So when your motivation isn't high, you have to rely on discipline. Discipline requires some willpower. Discipline is sticking to the plan even when you don't feel like it, right? Motivation is sticking to the plan when you feel like it. Discipline is sticking to the plan when you don't feel like it. So some tips that I like to have, some tips that I would like to give you that I use when my motivation isn't very high is tell yourself on a day when you're supposed to practice, you don't feel like practicing, but there's really no other reason for you to not practice. Tell yourself to just go and do your warm-up. Right, so before my practice sessions, I do maybe 5 to 10 minutes of some dynamic stretching, and I'll throw a few shots just to get the body warm. And if you do your warm-up and you still are just like, man, I don't want to be here, you're mentally checked out, you're tired, you're dragging, if you're still feeling that way after you've done your warm-up and you've thrown a few shots, pack it up and go home, take a rest day, to make sure you get lots of sleep, eat some good food, and then on your next practice day, come and try it again, all right? That's totally fine to do every now and again. We don't want you to get burnt out. This is supposed to be fun. But what usually happens is once you start, that inertia, that momentum, you kind of go like, you know what? I already started. I'll just finish it out. And I would say 9 times out of 10, just starting is enough to actually get you to do the full session when you don't feel like it. Second little trick to help when your motivation is low is instead of doing your planned drills, do something that's a little bit more fun or make a game out of it. An example, perhaps you were going to go work on backhand technique today, but the idea of just sitting there and grinding the same little thing over and over and over again just sounds awful. You can switch that out for something a little bit more fun. Maybe go to the practice basket and play Jai-Lai or some other fun putting game. Try to set a high score and beat your high score. Play an approach game. Just do something that's a little bit more fun. Because when you are still getting better at a skill at that point, both putting and approaching are very important skills, even if that's not the one that you're primarily focusing on right now. But it can also serve as a reminder of like, oh yeah, this is fun. And it doesn't need to be a drag all of the time because it can feel very grindy, especially if you're working through some plateaus. So if you're just really, really not feeling the net drills or whatever, swap it out for something fun. Totally fine to do every now and again, and it is still making you better at disc golf. Now, our eventual goal for long-term success in getting better at disc golf is to make practice a habit. Okay, so motivation again, it kind of comes and goes when you feel like it. Discipline is another strong thing, but it is finite. The amount of willpower you have is not an infinite source, and you don't want to have to lean on it too much. The more you have to lean on it, the harder it is long term to stick to the plan. So we want to start forming habits around practice. We want practice to not just be a thing that we make ourselves do because we have some goal off in the future, but we want to get to a point where practice is just something that we do, right? It almost feels weird if we don't do it. For example, how much discipline does it take to, say, take a shower before you go to bed, or whenever you take a shower, or to brush your teeth? It doesn't take discipline to do those things. You just do them. You've been doing them for so long, it would be weird if you didn't do them. That's what we want practice to feel like. Tips for building good habits. Number one, habit pairing. So taking a habit that you already have and associating something in either preparing for or going to do practice with that habit. Say you're getting your clothes laid out for work the next day, go ahead and get your bag put together and your disc golf clothes put together for the next day as well, so that it's one less thing you have to do tomorrow when you're getting ready to go practice. That I like to use is just anytime you can remove or minimize barriers to adherence. So say you practice after work. You go to work, you drive through traffic, you come home, you change into your clothes, you get all of your stuff together, you go to the practice field. But sometimes you're tired because there was traffic and your boss yelled at you or whatever, and you sit down on the couch and suddenly it's really, really hard to get yourself to stand up, go change clothes, and go back out into the world and do your disc golf practice. If that's happening to you, you could just take your stuff with you to work and then change clothes and go straight to the field, or even better, go to a field close to work, so by the time you drive home you don't even have to deal with traffic because it's already cleared. And now you don't have to worry about that couch, like weighing yourself down on the couch and not being able to get up and go practice. You're more likely to stick to it. So just finding little things like that, where you can pair your habits together, or where you can kind of make it easier, like reduce the activation energy to actually go and do your practice. Let's talk about goals, because what is a New Year's resolution but a goal, right? Personally, I don't think goals are really that important. I think they do have their place, but they are less important than actually doing the work, right? I think it's great if you want to have a big goal. Maybe your big goal is I want to get on tour someday, or I want to win an A tier, or whatever. It can be, having a big goal is fine, but understand that they can be motivating or demotivating depending on the context. Goals are often very motivating when we're first getting started because we're excited. We see this future self where we're really, really good at disc golf. We're smashing, we're winning tournaments, we're going on tour, whatever. And it makes you feel really good to kind of envision that version of yourself. But that same big goal can become very demotivating when you hit plateaus. Right, so plateau's inevitable, where you're working really hard through a problem and it just doesn't seem to be happening, and then you try to see that vision of yourself that you saw earlier where you're on tour and you're winning all of this stuff. It can be very demotivating because that goal can suddenly seem very far away and very unattainable. So just understand that it's totally fine to have goals, but personally I think you make that goal, you kind of put it up on a shelf and you don't really think about it. You come up with your plan and then you focus on the day-to-day and the week-to-week execution of that plan, and then slowly over time you will get better at disc golf, and maybe that goal gets a little bit closer. Ultimately that goal, just having that goal, is not really going to do much for you. It is the day-to-day and week-to-week work. It's the planning and the maximizing motivation and the leaning on discipline and the building habits. That's the stuff that's going to make you reach your goal, not just setting the goal itself. So my recommendation, totally fine to have goals, but understand that you need to focus in on the work. To summarize everything I just talked about, let things inspire you. Let that be a spark to get you started, but realize that it's temporary and that it's not going to push you through the entire year or however long you decide to pursue disc golf. You need to come up with a plan that you can stick to, understanding that consistency and adherence are number one priority. Next is you want to start out working on a skill that gets you really, really excited and that's going to help keep your motivation high as often as possible. Work on one thing per skill category at a time. Our brains just don't do well when we're trying to learn two big things at once. Better to focus on one thing. When your motivation is low, that's when you're going to need to rely on discipline and willpower to stick to the plan. And then over time, as you notice barriers to adherence, do your best to minimize or remove those altogether so that you're able to form really, really good habits, make practicing a habit. And understand that habit building is the thing that is critical to your long-term success. So when you're starting out, you're going to rely on motivation a lot, you're going to rely on discipline a lot, but over time the goal is to make practice a habit so that you're not having to rely on things as fleeting as motivation or as limited as willpower. And lastly, goals are totally fine to have, but ultimately not that important. You need to zero in on the day-to-day work that's going to get you in the direction of just generally getting better. That's the thing that matters. That's it. Those are my recommendations for how to crush your 2025 disc golf New Year's resolutions. If you guys have any other really cool ideas for how to build habits, how to motivate yourself, drop those in the comments because I'm sure that will help somebody out there. And make sure you like and subscribe and all the things. I'll catch you guys in the next one.